1 Thieding North Signal Street. I hope that you have read my December 23rd comment letter outlining my concerns with this project, and also have received letters from 2 preeminent Southern California archaeologists contained within your meeting materials. One being from Mr. Ronald May of Legacy 106, and one from Mr. John Foster of Greenwood and Associates. To the back of your handout, I have also attached emails received from an experienced CEQA attorney, Mr. Kevin Johnson, and another respected archaeologist with extensive experience in Chumash archaeology, Dr. Chester King. Please bear with me in my presentation, as it is somewhat changed from what I've handed out, given the significant new information presented tonight about this project and its scope. I will begin with Ojai and its values. Ojai values its community, its heritage, and its history. Its Chumash name means moon, and it is time to shine some light on the darkness of this project proposal and the city's processing thereof. The current project the current project record lacks factual evidence to allow for informed decision-making by members of the public as well as the City Council. Not only was the original staff report void of information about the scope of the project, but potential impacts to cultural resources identified in a 2002 final environmental impact report are not addressed, nor is the development's compliance with the Ojai General Plan that requires conservation of cultural resources. And now there is confusion about the current project. My understanding was what was brought before us was a revised project based on the city staff report that says it was substantially revised, and my understanding that this was not given appropriate public review or review by the Historic Preservation Commission and Planning Commission. Additionally, numerous procedural missteps have been made. An exemption from environmental review under CEQA is recommended by city staff without factual evidence that this project will not impact cultural resources. The current project lacks appropriate information, shortcuts the environmental review procedure and public participation, appeared to have substantially changes to the project scope midstream without public notice of the new scope, nor were minutes made available from previous public hearings on the project. The City Council has the authority, obligation, and the means to correct these missteps. Let's first take a look at the setting we know and love as Ojai. Ojai has invested in its historical culture as a means of appreciation for its fair bearers and recognizes the inherent value in its history. The City of Ojai supports the Ojai Valley Museum, and the Historic Preservation Commission stands to promote and protect Ojai's heritage. This is a strong acknowledgement that Ojai's prehistoric and historic cultures are part of its identity. It is what makes Ojai unique and attracts visitors. Therefore, it is not a surprise that the Historic Preservation Commission and the Planning Commission both voted to protect the historic Neff Lounge, as did the commissions and the City Council when the Neff Lounge was designated Ojai's Historic Landmark Number 9 in 2006. The Ojai Valley Inn also recognizes the value of historic designation and promotes itself as a historic hotel of America. On the other hand, Ojai City staff, who are relatively new to the community, appear unaware of the intrinsic value that Ojai residents place on its history and are dismissive of concerns of the Historic Preservation Commission and community members. This public participation is required by both California's Civil Procedure and the California Environmental Quality Act, otherwise known as CEQA. These are just some of the problems with this project. Now let's take a look at the project itself. Firstly, the scope of the original project is incomplete, inaccurate, and misleading. This is the project that was presented to the public and the Historic Preservation and Planning Commissions on December 11th. The City of Ojai Administrative Report dated December 5th, 2014, signed by Ms. Kathleen Wald, is insufficient and does not adequately nor accurately describe the scope of the project and its potential environmental impacts. Potential for adverse impact to historical resources must be identified and evaluated before a determination of CEQA applicability can be made. The City's Administrative Report for Work Permit 14-18 1. Provides no meaningful description of the project site or the cultural or environmental setting. 2. Lacks discussion of general plan consistency with the cultural resource section of the conservation element. And 3. Lacks discussion of possible impacts to potential archaeological resources. Evidence of potential impact to cultural resources at the Ojai Valley Inn is supported by the 2002 Environmental Impact Report. This report, which was certified by the City Council, asserts the potential for undetected archaeological and/or cultural resources to be uncovered due to grading and construction activities at the inn. The current project involves these activities around the swimming pool in addition to construction of new cabanas. Excavation activities into an undiscovered resource could destroy portions of the site, disturb its integrity and context, unearth human remains, or impair the scientific value of the resource. This represents a potentially significant impact. The Cultural Resources section of the Narrative Explanation of Checklist further discusses the potential for prehistoric and historical cultural resources and provides recommendations for review by qualified professionals. In addition, the January 9, 2002 letter from the Native American Heritage Commission outlines measures, quote, to adequately assess and mitigate project-related impacts of archaeological resources, unquote. It is also noted that the cultural resource investigation reported in the 2002 final environmental impact report consisted of an archaeological records search and surface survey of only the project impact areas proposed in 2002. The scope of the current project relative to the 2002 investigation is unclear. It is unclear if the impact area is the same or whether further investigation is required. It is also unclear if this project falls under the umbrella of the 2002 EIR. If it falls under the 2002 EIR, CEQA requires review to assess potential new environmental impacts and changes in regulations. As the 2002 EIR is nearly 13 years old, standard of practice in the industry includes an updated archaeological resources record search by a qualified archaeologist. These concerns were brought before the Planning Commission on December 11th and were dismissed by city staff, stating that this project does not meet the city's thresholds for cultural resource significance. Why then was environmental review for cultural resources done in the inn in 2002? And how do they explain the findings of potentially significant impacts to cultural resources on the property? Preeminent archaeologists have also expressed concern about the need for appropriate environmental review for this project. Mr. Ronald May of Legacy 106, an archaeology and historic consulting firm, states that the 2002 certified EIR mandates a very clear scoping of all earth-disturbing activities, that the proposed work, as described, constitute direct and indirect impacts to cultural resource setting and potential archaeological sites, and that this project cannot be exempted from environmental review. Mr. John Foster, whose cultural research firm has more than 60 years of experience in Ventura County, questions this project scope, definitions used, and states, quote, while it is true in the case of a void created by excavating a swimming pool that there might be nothing left in the cavity, it does not mean that the adjoining area has been disturbed, nor that the remaining archaeological data have lost all information. The determination of those conditions could only be made by a qualified archaeologist, unquote. And Dr. Chester King, a preeminent expert in Chumash archaeology, requests the rejection of a categorical exemption and environmental review of the potential archaeological resources in the project area. Under CEQA Guidelines Section 15064, the city shall consider the views held by members of the public. If there is a question in determining the significant potential impact, the city must follow proper environmental review procedures. The city has now received requests from the Historic Preservation Commission members, the local Chumash tribe, the public, and expert comments by preeminent archaeologists as well as a CEQA attorney recommending further review of the environmental impacts of this project. Moving on to the project presented before us tonight, there's some confusion. Admittedly, I'm still a little confused. Not only did the original project lack proper scope and environmental review, we are now presented with what appeared to be a revised project void of any description of scope, and the information from the city provided appears to be misleading. It feels like the Community Development Department is playing a shell game with this project. The city administrative report states that the scope of remodeling is, quote, substantially less than the original applications denied by the Historic Preservation Commission and Planning Commission. This is not an appeal. This is a new project. It should follow the city's review procedures. It should be sent back to the Historic Preservation Commission for their determination of whether the proposed changes might damage the architecturally defining features that make it historic. The Historic Preservation Commission must be given the opportunity to clarify the types of remodeling allowed under the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. A revised project must be remanded back to the Commission for a vote. City staff December 17th administrative report is misleading and suggests a flawed landmark process in 2006 and current economic hardship, which are both irrelevant to this project. The 2006 record reflects the proper steps were taken, there were no objections, and the City Council acted accordingly. There is no factual evidence that the proposed renovations to the lounge, pool, and main lobby will improve the inn's financial standing. Additionally, reference made to city municipal code regarding economic hardship considerations may be misrepresented as this regulation is in reference to resale or value of the property. It is further noted that minutes of the December 11th joint meeting of the Historic Preservation and Planning Commissions, at which the Neff Lounge renovation was denied, are neither provided nor available. In addition, the Community Development Director improperly makes reference to reuse in this context, and the historian's report relied on by city staff is paid for by the applicant and is thereby fraught with a legal and financial conflict of interest. Further, as is the case with cultural resources, city staff has no expertise to conclude that this project will not impact historical resources and thereby recommend exemption. This is a job for the Historic Preservation Commission and other experts. As noted, issues raised by the city staff report are irrelevant. What is relevant are the missteps in this process. No environmental review of cultural resources has been given. There's been a shortcutting of the environmental review procedure and public disclosure through use of a categorical exemption. Seemingly, there has been substantial changes to project scope midstream without proper public notice of the new scope and records from previous public hearings, and not sending the revised project back to the Historic Preservation Commission and Planning Commission. City staff has recommended approval of the revised project under a Class 1 categorical exemption from CEQA. This means that city staff assert that the project will not have potential adverse impacts on historical or cultural resources. Yet conditions of approval reflect 2002 final EIR mitigation measures to reduce or eliminate potential impacts to cultural resources. These conditions of approval do not remedy the omission of appropriate consideration of environmental consequences by the city. A project cannot be exempted from environmental review, asserting no environmental impact, and then require conditions to reduce impact on the environment. The current project must be examined in light of the whole record, including the 2002 Final Environmental Impact Report for renovations at the Ojai Valley Inn, which reflected potentially significant environmental impacts. CEQA is not a game of Monopoly. You cannot pass go and collect a categorical exemption for a project that already has been determined to have a significant effect on the environment. The city must take the appropriate steps to protect the environment. Interestingly, the city administrative report, resolutions, and recommendations contain no reference to CEQA guidelines or statutes allowing exemption of this project. Ojai's Municipal Code, Section 4-8.16, requires findings of fact and reason to reach a decision. City documents do not adequately describe the project, its potential environmental impact, or rationale for recommended exemption given the potential impact of this project. As stated by a land use attorney and CEQA attorney with over 30 years of experience, the city appears to have no factual basis for the conclusions that there will be no impact on significant resources, and the use of a categorical exemption from environmental review in this context is inappropriate. Public participation and informed decision-making are at the heart of environmental protections and are required by CEQA and California civil law. This project is void of necessary information, is misleading and inaccurate, and appeared to have been substantially revised without adequate information, proper public noticing of review, or review by the Historic Preservation Commission or Planning Commission. You can correct these current procedural errors now. It's time to do the right thing for Ojai and for the community. I urge you not to make a permanent mistake that will cost the community valued non-renewable resources and continue the precedence of ignoring cultural resource protections. Given the status of the project before you tonight, I respectfully request that you indefinitely continue these work permits to allow city staff to correctly advertise the scope of the project and its potential environmental impacts. 2, I request a project scope that is accurate and complete, and that you require city staff to appropriately identify, evaluate, and disclose all potential environmental impacts to historic and cultural resources. This should include independent professional review by a qualified architectural historian and a registered professional archaeologist to assess potential impacts to historic and cultural resources with consultant costs reimbursed by the Ojai Valley Inn and consultation with the local Chumash tribe. 3, I ask that you require the city staff to comply with CEQA, and 4, require proper noticing of all activities. Ojai values its community, Chumash tribal members, its heritage and its history, and requires the protection of cultural resources. On November 11th, a city council member stated that we don't have to wait for protection of cultural resources. Let's start tonight. I echo the words of an Ojai Valley Inn representative this evening saying time is of the essence. The City Council has the authority, obligation, and the means to ensure Ojai's community values are upheld, cultures are respected, and that laws are followed. Thank you for your time, and I'd like to reserve any remaining time for a rebuttal if needed.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Thieding. And again, I just want to stress we're going to be...
I had requested time for a rebuttal at the end, so I appreciate the opportunity to speak again. And I appreciate the Inn's respect for Ojai Valley and their care and concern for cultural resources. But this just doesn't change the facts. The Inn has asserted that there were no resources found in 2002, but without a guarantee that this project is going to go in the same footprint without any exterior disturbance of the earth, they just cannot guarantee that cultural resources might be impacted for this project. In addition, we heard that they're building new cabanas in the area, so there's going to be new earth-disturbing activities for the project. Second, the inn asserts that proper CEQA analysis was done, and they discuss only the historic resources, being the historic Neff Lounge. Again, no discussion of cultural resources here. And I again remind the city of the public concerns for appropriate environmental concern or environmental review, which is required by CEQA guidelines. The whole of the record for this project should be considered, and that does include possible significant impacts to cultural resources. My third and final point is the discussion on 8A and the condition of approval for monitoring. The condition of approval that's spelled out by city staff requires both a qualified archaeologist as well as a Native American monitor. I've only heard, in speaking so far in the last 3 hours, only heard about a Native American monitor. I hadn't heard discussion of a qualified archaeologist. This is why the language is very important. And again, the requirement for this as a conditional approval is not a substitute for appropriate environmental review under CEQA. That environmental review process allows the public to participate in the process. By granting a categorical exemption, you deny the public that process. A project cannot be exempted from environmental review, asserting no environmental impacts, and then have conditions of approval on that project to mitigate potential impacts of that project. Thank you.